They say you should never mess with a bored HOA president, especially one who treats property lines like battlefield frontiers. I looked out my cabin window and saw a crane truck dropping metal fences like I was being quarantined by a petty dictator. No warning, no explanation, just a woman with a clipboard, a god complex, and the subtlety of a wrecking ball. Violation of aesthetic harmony, she claimed. Ma'am, it's a log cabin, not a nightclub. What happened next made me question everything I thought I knew about homeowner rights, personal sanity, and fence logistics. Drop a comment telling me your worst HOA encounter, because you might not sleep easy after this one. I woke up that morning at my cabin in Juniper Crest Reserve, Colorado, expecting another quiet weekend of fixing equipment and enjoying the mountain air. I had bought this place 2 years ago from a family who abandoned it after the wildfires swept through, and had spent countless hours rebuilding it from the foundation up. The sound of heavy machinery wasn't exactly what I wanted to hear with my first cup of coffee. When I stepped outside, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. A massive crane truck was positioning metal barriers around my entire property, and there was a sign that read, HOA violation in progress, being processed. The whole scene looked like they were setting up a construction zone, except the construction was apparently my eviction. That's when I saw her. Evelyn Crowder stepped out of a pristine black SUV wearing a business suit that looked way too formal for a Saturday morning in the mountains. She had white gloves on like she was handling evidence at a crime scene, and she carried a clipboard thick enough to be a novel. She walked around my cabin like a health inspector examining a restaurant, making notes and taking pictures of every detail. I opened my door and called out, "Excuse me, what's going on here?" She didn't even look up from her clipboard when she replied, in a voice that sounded like she was reading corporate bylaws. Violation of HOA setback requirements, she said. Immediate evacuation required. I stepped outside, still holding my coffee mug, trying to process what was happening. Setback requirements? What are you talking about? I built this cabin legally 2 years ago. I have all the permits. Evelyn finally looked at me with the kind of expression you'd give someone who just admitted they don't understand basic math. New regulation affected last week. All cabins must be 15 feet from property boundaries. Your cabin is only 12 feet from the eastern border. I felt my stomach drop. New regulation? When was this decided? I never received any notification about new rules. She adjusted her white gloves and said with the kind of casual cruelty that only comes from bureaucratic power, "Perhaps you should check your email more frequently. The rule is now in effect." I pulled out my phone right there and started scrolling through my emails frantically. 2 months of messages and not a single communication from the HOA about any rule changes. "Mrs. Crowder, I don't see any email about new regulations. Nothing at all." She waved her hand dismissively like I was a child making excuses for not doing homework. "It might be in your spam folder. Regardless, the regulation is now active and enforceable." That's when I started to understand this wasn't really about building codes or property lines. The way she said regardless had a finality to it that told me she didn't care about my emails, my permits, or my rights. "This area needs higher standards," she continued, and I caught something in her tone that made my blood run cold. Then came the ultimatum that would change everything. Evelyn placed a digital timer on the stone table by my front door and set it for 30 minutes. "You have this amount of time to remove essential personal items. After that, the cabin will be sealed until you comply with regulations." I stared at the timer counting down and felt my heart racing. No one had ever threatened to lock me out of my own property before. "I need time to contact a lawyer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me with those cold eyes and said, "There's no time for that. I have the authority to protect this community, and you can file an appeal later. Right now, you need to leave." I looked at my cabin, the place where I'd spent 2 years of my life, rebuilding from nothing but ashes and foundation stones. Every board, every nail, every window had been installed with my own hands. The thought of this woman sealing it off like a condemned building made me feel sick. But as I watched Evelyn standing there with her timer and her clipboard, enjoying every second of her power trip, I realized something important. She thought she was in control of this situation. She thought she could intimidate me into submission with bureaucratic threats and legal-sounding language. What Evelyn didn't know was that she had just woken up something inside me that she was never going to be able to control. The timer showed 28 minutes remaining as Evelyn smiled with the satisfaction of someone who believed they'd won before the game even started. My peaceful weekend cabin was now surrounded by cold metal like a prison. But I wasn't the one who was about to become a prisoner. Evelyn Crowder had no idea that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, and that her own timer was about to become the countdown to her complete and total downfall. With 25 minutes left on Evelyn's timer, I did what any person with a smartphone and a functioning brain would do in the 21st century. I started researching. I pulled up HOA Rule Changes Notification Requirements Colorado and started reading as fast as I could. Within 5 minutes, I found exactly what I needed to know. According to Colorado state law, HOA communities must provide 30 days written notice before implementing any new regulation. They also need a community vote for major changes. Armed with this information, I walked back outside, where Evelyn was still standing like a security guard protecting a construction site. "Mrs. Crowder," I said, holding up my phone with the legal text displayed, "according to Colorado state law, the HOA is required to provide 30 days notice before implementing new regulations." I watched her face change slightly, a tiny crack in her confident facade. "This is an emergency regulation," she replied, straightening her posture. "Emergency rules don't require the standard notification period when there's a risk to community standards." I could tell she was making this up as she went along, but she delivered it with the kind of authority that had probably intimidated other homeowners into submission. "What exactly is the emergency?" I asked. "My cabin has been here for 2 years without any problems." That's when Evelyn made her first major mistake. "The risk to aesthetic standards," she said, and then added the words that would eventually destroy her. "This area needs to be cleaned up of elements that don't belong." I had been secretly recording our conversation on my phone from the moment I came back outside, and I made sure to ask her to clarify. "What do you mean by elements that don't belong?" Her answer was exactly what I hoped it would be, and exactly what would hang her later. "You understand what I mean. Single men like you aren't exactly ideal for a family neighborhood like this." There it was. The real reason behind her fake emergency regulation. This wasn't about building codes or property lines, this was about discrimination, pure and simple. Evelyn Crowder wanted me gone because I didn't fit her narrow definition of who belonged in Juniper Crest Reserve. I kept recording as she continued digging her own grave. "Mrs. Crowder, are you saying that single homeowners aren't welcome here?" She must have realized she'd said too much because she suddenly became defensive. "I'm saying that community standards must be maintained, and certain lifestyle choices can impact property values." When Evelyn noticed I was holding my phone, she panicked. "Are you recording this conversation?" she demanded. "Yes, I am," I replied calmly. "I have the right to record conversations on my own property." That's when she really lost it. "Delete that recording immediately," she shouted, dropping her clipboard and reaching toward my phone. I stepped back and said, "I think this conversation is over. You've made your position very clear." But Evelyn wasn't done making bad decisions. "Fine," she screamed. "If you want to play hardball, I'll show you hardball. I'm calling the police right now." She pulled out her own phone and dialed 911. "I need to report a trespassing situation and threatening behavior at Juniper Crest Reserve," she said into the phone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was actually calling the police on me for standing on my own property. While she was on the phone with the dispatcher, I quickly gathered the most important documents from inside my cabin. My property deed, building permits, tax records, and insurance papers. I had a feeling I was going to need them very soon. 15 minutes later, I heard the sound of sirens approaching. A police cruiser pulled up, and Officer Mike Brady stepped out. He was a middle-aged guy with the kind of tired expression that suggested he'd dealt with HOA drama before. He looked at the scene in front of him, the metal barriers, me standing with a stack of documents, and Evelyn clutching her clipboard like a shield, and I could see him mentally preparing for another ridiculous suburban dispute. "Good morning, folks," he said. "I understand there's some kind of property dispute here?" Evelyn immediately launched into her prepared speech. "Officer, this man is trespassing on property that's in violation of HOA regulations. I've ordered him to evacuate, but he's refusing to comply and has been recording me without permission." I waited for her to finish and then calmly handed Officer Brady my documents. "Officer, here's my property deed, building permits, tax records, and insurance information. This is my legal property, and I haven't violated any regulations." Officer Brady examined the papers for a few minutes while Evelyn stood there looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Mr. Whitman," Officer Brady said after reviewing everything, "all of your documentation appears to be in order. This is clearly your legal property." Then he turned to Evelyn. "Ma'am, HOA regulations don't override property ownership rights. You can't prevent a legal property owner from accessing their own land." Evelyn's face went white as she realized her power trip had just hit a brick wall of actual law enforcement. But the HOA rules, she started to protest. Ma'am, Officer Brady interrupted, I strongly suggest you remove these barriers. Mr. Whitman has every right to be on his property. As the crane truck was forced to remove the metal barriers, Evelyn stood there with her face red from anger and embarrassment. She'd been so confident in her authority, so sure that she could intimidate me into submission, that she never considered what would happen when real law enforcement got involved. Officer Brady got back in his cruiser and drove away, but not before giving Evelyn a look that suggested he'd remember her if she tried this kind of stunt again. The barriers were gone, but I could see in Evelyn's eyes that this was far from over. She'd been humiliated in front of a police officer, and people like her don't handle humiliation well. As she got back in her black SUV, I realized that the game had completely changed, and it was time for me to start playing offense instead of defense. The barriers were down, but Evelyn wasn't finished trying to destroy my life. As Officer Brady drove away, she turned to me with the kind of cold fury that only comes from someone who's used to getting their way and just got publicly embarrassed. Officer or no officer, she said, I'm still going to fine you $500 per day for aesthetic violations. That fine starts tomorrow, and it continues until you comply with community standards. I looked at her standing there in her business suit, still clutching that clipboard like it contained the secrets of the universe, and I realized she was about to make her second major mistake of the day. Based on what regulation, I asked? The regulation that doesn't exist? Evelyn's jaw tightened. The regulation exists. I have meeting minutes and signatures from the board members who approved it. That's when I knew I had her. I'd like to see those meeting minutes and signatures, I said. As a homeowner, I have the right to review all HOA documentation. For the first time since this whole thing started, Evelyn looked genuinely worried. Those are confidential board documents, she said, but her voice had lost its earlier authority. I pulled out my phone and called my neighbor 2 houses down. Hey Jim, did you receive any notification about an HOA meeting last week? I put the phone on speaker so Evelyn could hear the response. Meeting? What meeting? Nobody told me about any meeting. I hung up and immediately called another board member. Same response. What meeting? I don't know anything about any meeting. By the time I called the third board member and got the same answer, Evelyn looked like she was about to be sick. Officer Brady might have left, but the truth was still standing right there between us. Mrs. Crowder, I said, watching her face carefully, it seems like none of the board members know about this emergency meeting where new regulations were supposedly approved. She was scrambling now, trying to come up with an explanation that would save face. It was a phone consultation, an emergency decision? I don't have to explain HOA internal processes to you. But the more she talked, the deeper she dug herself into a hole. I had her on recording admitting to discrimination, and now I had proof that she'd fabricated the entire regulation that started this mess. That's when I noticed something interesting. During our confrontation, 4 or 5 neighbors had come outside to see what all the commotion was about. They were standing at a respectful distance, but I could tell they were listening to every word. These were people who lived in the same community, who dealt with the same HOA board, and who had probably wondered about Evelyn's methods before today. I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to argue with Evelyn in private, I was going to make this whole situation completely public. I went inside my cabin and printed out every relevant document I could find: property deed, building permits, email correspondence with the HOA, and a timeline of everything that had happened today. Then I went outside and started taping these documents to the exterior wall of my cabin, creating what I called my public evidence sleeves. Each document was clearly labeled and protected in plastic sleeves so anyone could read them. Harassment timeline, read one header. Fabricated regulations, read another. Discrimination recording available upon request, read a third. The neighbors who had been watching from a distance started walking over to read the documents. An elderly woman from down the street shook her head as she read through the timeline. "My goodness," she said loud enough for Evelyn to hear. "She actually threatened you like this?" A middle-aged man who I guessed was Sanders from the end of the street pointed to the section labeled Discrimination Recording Available and asked, "Did you really record her saying all this stuff?" I nodded and held up my phone. When he listened to the recording, his eyes went wide and he turned to speak loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Good Lord, I thought she was just difficult like some rich lady. Who would have thought?" Word spread quickly through the community. Within an hour, there were a dozen people standing around reading my evidence board and discussing what they'd learned. Several of them mentioned that Evelyn had targeted their families with questionable violations in the past. One neighbor said, "She fined us $200 for having our garbage cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours. I thought that was normal HOA stuff. Another added, she threatened to put a lien on our house because our mailbox wasn't the exact shade of black she wanted. Evelyn stood there watching her reputation crumble in real time. She tried one last desperate threat. "Remove that board immediately! That's defamation, and I'll sue you for everything you're worth." I looked at her calmly and said, "Mrs. Crowder, these are factual documents displayed on my own property. If you'd like to challenge the accuracy of any information posted here, I'm happy to provide additional evidence." She realized she had no legal ground to stand on and no authority to force me to remove anything from my own property. As more neighbors gathered around the evidence board, I could see something powerful happening. For the first time, people in the community were seeing documented proof of HOA abuse. They were learning about their rights as homeowners and realizing that they didn't have to accept harassment and intimidation from board members who thought power meant they could ignore the law. An elderly neighbor turned to me and said, "Carter, if you need witnesses to any of this behavior, we'll support you." Another neighbor added, "She harassed the Smith family last year the exact same way." By late afternoon, there was a small crowd of people discussing HOA reform and homeowner rights in front of my cabin. Evelyn watched from her SUV for a while, but eventually drove away with a final threat shouted through her window. "This isn't over, Whitman. I'll make sure you never have peace in this community." As I watched her drive away, I looked at the crowd of neighbors who were still reading documents and sharing their own stories of HOA abuse. That's when I realized something important. Evelyn wanted to make my life a public spectacle to embarrass me into submission. But I was about to turn that strategy completely against her. If she wanted attention, I was going to give her more attention than she ever bargained for. That evening, I sat in my cabin looking at the evidence board outside and thinking about Evelyn's threat to make sure I never had peace. She wanted to turn my life into a public circus to humiliate me. But what if I turned that circus into something that actually served the community? What if instead of hiding from the attention, I embraced it and used it to educate people about their rights? That's when I came up with what I now call the best idea of my life. But as I looked around at the fading sunlight over the trees, another thought hit me. What if I wasn't the only one? What if there were dozens of families just like mine, quietly suffering through Evelyn's reign, too afraid or too exhausted to fight back? Maybe, just maybe, if I opened my door to them, they'd walk through. Not just for me, but for themselves. This wasn't just about fighting back anymore. It was about showing people what standing up looked like. If Evelyn wanted my cabin to be a public issue, then I was going to make it truly public in a way that would help people and drive her absolutely insane. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store and bought materials to build a large wooden sign. I spent the afternoon crafting something that looked professional but still had a handmade charm. "Where OA went wrong, learn for free," read the main text. Below that, in smaller letters, "Homeowner Rights Education Tours, Real Case Study in Progress." At the bottom, I added, "Voluntary donations welcome for Community Education Fund." I did some quick research online to make sure I wasn't breaking any laws. What I found was exactly what I hoped. As a property owner, I had the right to invite guests onto my private property for educational purposes. The HOA couldn't restrict reasonable guest access, and educational tours with voluntary donations were completely legal. I wasn't running a commercial business, I was providing community education about property rights and HOA law. I created a simple post for our community's online group. Free education about homeowner rights. See a real-time case study of HOA overreach happening right here in Juniper Crest. Learn how to protect yourself and your property. Tours available this weekend, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. I kept the tone informative and helpful rather than angry or confrontational. Saturday morning arrived and I wasn't sure what to expect. At 10 a.m. sharp, the first car pulled up, then another. By 10:30, there were 12 people gathered around my evidence board, asking questions and taking notes. I gave them a structured presentation that lasted about 30 minutes. 10 minutes explaining basic homeowner rights in plain English, 10 minutes walking them through the evidence of what had happened to me, and 10 minutes answering questions about HOA law and property rights. The visitors were genuinely impressed by how calm and professional I kept everything. Instead of ranting about Evelyn or trying to get people angry, I focused on education. I explained how HOA boards are supposed to operate, what rights homeowners have, and how to recognize when those rights are being violated. People left with printed information about Colorado property law and contact information for legal resources. That's when Evelyn discovered what I was doing. Around 11 a.m., she drove past and saw cars parked outside my cabin. She pulled over and marched across my property like she owned the place. "What is this circus?" she demanded, waving her clipboard at the small crowd gathered around my evidence board. I smiled and said, "Educational tours, Mrs. Crowder, perfectly legal on my private property. Would you like to hear my presentation about HOA law and homeowner rights?" "These people are disrupting our peaceful community," she shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. One of the visitors, a middle-aged man who'd been taking notes, raised his hand like he was in a classroom. "Excuse me, are you the HOA president they've been talking about?" Evelyn's face turned red as she realized she was standing in front of a dozen people who had just learned about her illegal tactics. "These people are destroying property values," she screamed. The same visitor looked confused. "Ma'am, we're just learning about our rights as homeowners. Why would you not want people to understand their legal protections?" Evelyn couldn't come up with a good answer for that, so she tried a different approach. "They're running an illegal business on residential property. I calmly explained to everyone that they were my invited guests on private property and that educational tours with voluntary donations were completely legal under Colorado law." As the morning went on, more people arrived. Some were neighbors who had heard about what happened. Others were people from nearby communities who were curious about the HOA education angle. Word was spreading on social media about the real-time case study happening in Juniper Crest Reserve. By the end of the day, 25 people had attended my tours, and I'd collected $180 in voluntary donations. Evelyn spent most of the day watching from her window, occasionally coming outside to glare at the visitors or make threatening comments that only served to prove my point about harassment and intimidation. Every time she appeared, people would ask if she was the president mentioned in the case study, and her angry responses just reinforced everything I told them about abuse of power. One woman walked up to me quietly, maybe in her 60s, and said something I'll never forget. "I lost my husband last year. Evelyn fined me for having his memorial flowers outside too long. I didn't know I had a right to say no." That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just a case study. It was a lifeline, and I wasn't giving it up for anything. By Sunday evening, I realized that I'd accidentally created something much bigger than a simple response to harassment. I'd created a community resource that people actually needed and wanted. And judging by the messages I was getting online, next weekend was going to be even bigger. By Monday morning, my phone was ringing off the hook. Word about the weekend's educational tours had spread beyond Juniper Crest Reserve, and people were sharing the story across Colorado. The first call came from a reporter with Channel 9 News. "Mr. Whitman," she said, "we've heard about your unique approach to resolving HOA disputes. Would you be interested in an on-camera interview?" I agreed immediately. If this story was going to get media attention anyway, I wanted to make sure the facts were presented accurately. The reporter and her cameraman arrived Saturday morning, just as the second week of tours was getting started. I was amazed to see 35 people gathered around my evidence board, including several families who had driven over from neighboring towns. The reporter interviewed me for about 10 minutes, and I made sure to stay focused on the educational aspect of what I was doing. I explained homeowner rights, showed the evidence of fabricated regulations, and emphasized that my goal was to help people understand their legal protections, not to attack anyone personally. That's when Evelyn made her biggest mistake yet. While we were filming the interview, she marched over with her clipboard and tried to interrupt. "This is a harassment campaign," she announced to the camera. "These people are destroying the standards our community has worked to maintain." The reporter, being a professional journalist, kept the camera rolling and asked Evelyn to explain what she meant by community standards. "This is my standard," Evelyn shouted, gesturing wildly at the crowd of families and elderly couples who were quietly learning about property law. "This is my community." The clip of Evelyn shouting, "This is my standard," while pointing at a group of people who were just trying to educate themselves about their rights, went viral faster than anything I'd ever seen. By Sunday evening, that 5-second clip had been viewed over 50,000 times online. People started creating memes with screenshots of Evelyn's angry face and her quotes about community standards. Someone created a hashtag that I won't mention by name, but it referenced Juniper Crest and became a trending topic. That afternoon, I witnessed something that would stay with me forever. I saw Evelyn standing alone at her front gate, clutching her phone with a face that had gone completely pale, like someone who'd just received the worst news of their life. Messages were flooding in constantly. A car from the HOA office pulled up, and the driver handed her an envelope. Inside were formal complaints from 3 other residents. Evelyn didn't say a word, just quietly closed her door. but I heard the mail carrier tell the security guard, I just delivered 3 resignation letters with her forged signature to different organizations. Rumors spread faster than anything else. Evelyn wasn't just scared, she was falling apart. The media attention brought even more visitors the following weekend. Channel 9 ran my story on their evening news, and other Denver area stations picked it up. Colorado man fights HOA abuse with education tours, read one headline. Homeowner turns harassment into learning opportunity, read another. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive, focusing on the educational value of what I was doing and the broader issue of HOA accountability. By the third weekend, I was seeing people from across Colorado and even some from neighboring states. A young family approached me, the father pulling his small daughter along. He whispered to me, "We used to be terrified of Evelyn to the point where we didn't dare plant flowers in our own yard. But now, I think this community's actually changing." His wife nodded, adding, "For the first time in 2 years, we feel like we can breathe in our own neighborhood." I'd collected over $1,200 in voluntary donations, which I was using exactly as advertised, for a legal defense fund to help homeowners fight HOA abuse. More importantly, I'd created a network of people who were sharing information about property rights and supporting each other against bullying tactics from various HOA boards. An elderly couple from a neighboring community told me, "We drove 2 hours to get here because our HOA president uses the exact same intimidation tactics. We needed to see that someone could fight back and win." That's when Evelyn tried to stop me through legal action. She hired Johnson & Associates, a law firm that specialized in HOA disputes, and they sent me a cease and desist letter demanding that I stop the tours immediately. When the Channel 9 reporter heard about the legal threat, she came back to interview me about it. I showed her the letter on camera and explained why I believed everything I was doing was legal. Then I called a property rights attorney who agreed to appear on camera and explain why educational tours were protected speech. The interview with the cease and desist letter got even more attention than the original story. People were outraged that an HOA president would try to use lawyers to stop educational tours about homeowner rights. The attorney who appeared on camera made it clear that everything I was doing was completely legal, and that Evelyn's threats had no legal foundation. Within 48 hours of that interview airing, Evelyn's lawyer withdrew from representing her, citing client behavior inconsistent with legal strategy. Meanwhile, other neighbors in Juniper Crest Reserve were coming forward with their own stories about Evelyn's harassment tactics. An elderly neighbor told reporters about how Evelyn had tried to fine her for planting flowers that weren't on the approved plant list. Another neighbor shared emails where Evelyn had threatened to put a lien on his house for parking his work truck in his own driveway. A pattern of abuse and bullying was emerging, and it was all being documented by local media. The really interesting development was that people were starting to organize. Visitors to my tours weren't just learning about their rights. They were forming groups to support each other and share information about HOA problems in their own communities. I'd accidentally created a model that other homeowners could use to educate their neighbors and hold their own HOA boards accountable. One visitor from Boulder told me, "We're going back home to organize our own education tours. You've shown us that we don't have to take this abuse lying down." By the end of the month, I'd been featured on 5 different news stations, and my story had been shared thousands of times online. Evelyn's public image was completely destroyed. Her viral outburst had made her the face of HOA abuse across Colorado, and everywhere she went, people recognized her as the woman who tried to illegally evict a homeowner and then screamed at families who were learning about their rights. I could see her confidence evaporating with each passing day, but I also sensed that she wasn't finished yet. People like Evelyn don't just fade away when they're humiliated. They double down, and they plan something big. I had a feeling that our final confrontation was coming soon. Friday evening, I got a call that changed everything. The producer of Denver Morning Live wanted to feature my story on their weekend show, which reached viewers across the entire state. "We'd like to do a live remote broadcast from your cabin," she said. "Can you handle about 500 people?" I realized that my little educational tour had become something much bigger than I'd ever imagined. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore, it was about homeowner rights across Colorado, and people were driving from hours away to be part of what had become a genuine movement. I spent the week preparing for what I knew would be the biggest event yet. I rented portable facilities, organized parking with shuttle service from the community center, and set up multiple display stations so people could spread out and learn comfortably. I also arranged for volunteers from the community to help coordinate tours and answer questions. What had started as a one-man protest had become a professionally organized educational event that was drawing national attention to HOA accountability issues. But while I was preparing for success, Evelyn was preparing for war. I found out later that she had spent the week organizing what she called a counter-demonstration to protect community standards. She rallied the few supporters she had left and planned to stage her own rally across the street from my cabin. Her goal was to create a spectacle that would make my educational tours look like a neighborhood disturbance and hopefully convince the media that there were two sides to the story. I learned from a neighbor that Evelyn had been making desperate phone calls all week, trying to recruit people from other communities to join her protest. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather and the largest crowd I'd ever seen. By 9 a.m., there were over 150 people gathered around my property, and more cars were arriving every few minutes. The Denver Morning Live crew set up their remote broadcast equipment, and I could see camera crews from other stations positioning themselves to cover what everyone expected to be a significant event. I'd organized the tours to run every 30 minutes, with different stations covering various aspects of homeowner rights, HOA law, and documentation techniques. That's when Evelyn made her dramatic entrance. At exactly 10 a.m., just as the live television broadcast was starting, she arrived with 8 supporters carrying homemade signs that read, "Stop the harassment and protect our neighborhood standards." They set up across the street from my cabin like a competing rally, and Evelyn pulled out a megaphone that she must have borrowed from somewhere. "These people are destroying our peaceful community," she announced through the megaphone, her voice echoing across the crowd. I had a choice to make. I could respond with anger and turn this into a shouting match, or I could stick to my principles and maintain the educational focus that had gotten me this far. I picked up my own microphone and calmly announced to the crowd, "Everyone is welcome to hear all perspectives on this issue. Mrs. Crowder is certainly entitled to share her views." The crowd appreciated my fairness, and the contrast between my calm professionalism and Evelyn's angry shouting was obvious to everyone, especially the television cameras. The morning went beautifully for about 2 hours. People were engaged, asking great questions, and learning valuable information about their rights. The live television broadcast featured interviews with visitors who explained what they'd learned and why they thought the educational tours were important. But I could see Evelyn across the street getting more and more agitated as she watched the positive coverage of my event. Her supporters were slowly drifting away, some even crossing the street to join my educational tour. Around noon, she decided to escalate things. She abandoned her rally area and marched directly onto my property with her megaphone. "These displays are full of lies," she announced to anyone who would listen. Then she did something that shocked everyone, including me. She grabbed one of my information boards and tried to tear it down. "Lies! All lies!" she screamed, while several television cameras captured her destroying property. The crowd stepped back, not sure how to react to what was clearly inappropriate behavior. But I knew this was exactly the moment I'd been waiting for. While Evelyn was focused on destroying my displays, she didn't notice an elderly neighbor who had been supporting me from the beginning. The elderly woman was trying to sign a petition supporting homeowner rights when Evelyn, in her rage, shoved past her and knocked her to the ground. "Stop signing that garbage!" Evelyn screamed. The elderly woman fell hard, and several people rushed to help her up. She was shaken but not seriously injured. But the damage to Evelyn's reputation was complete and permanent. The crowd's reaction was immediate and unanimous. "You pushed an elderly woman?" someone shouted. "What kind of person does that?" asked another. That's when something unexpected happened. Someone in the crowd called out, "Why do you hate other people so much?" Evelyn stood there, trembling, and for the first time, her composed facade completely cracked. "Because I lost my son in a neighborhood like this," she screamed. "A drunk neighbor crashed into our yard and killed him. I swore I would never let any place I lived become that chaotic again." The entire crowd fell silent. The pain in her voice was real, raw, and heartbreaking. But then another voice from the crowd spoke up clearly. "Protecting your community isn't the same as oppressing your neighbors. That's the difference you never understood." Evelyn stared at the crowd, no longer screaming, just tears streaming down her face and her eyes completely hollow. When I saw her like that, I felt something I hadn't expected, genuine sadness for her. "I'm sorry for what you went through," I said to her, my voice carrying across the silent crowd. "I really am. But turning your pain into power over other people, trying to control their lives because of your fear, that's just creating new pain for innocent families." Evelyn looked at me, and for a moment I thought she might actually understand. But then Officer Brady arrived, responding to multiple calls about the disturbance. Within minutes, Officer Brady had to physically restrain Evelyn as she tried to continue destroying my property displays. Multiple witnesses confirmed that she had assaulted the elderly neighbor, and the entire incident had been captured on live television. As she was being handcuffed, Evelyn continued screaming about discrimination and harassment, apparently unaware that her own behavior was being broadcast live to hundreds of thousands of viewers across Colorado. "This is discrimination," she shouted as she was led to the police car. "They're ruining our community standards." The arrest was captured by every camera crew present, and within hours the footage was being shown on national news programs. The image of Evelyn being led away in handcuffs while screaming about community standards became an instant symbol of HOA abuse and the consequences of unchecked power. As the police car drove away, I addressed the crowd of over 200 people who had witnessed everything. "This was never about revenge against anyone," I said. "This was about standing up for basic fairness and helping people understand their rights." The standing ovation that followed lasted for 5 minutes and could be heard echoing across the entire valley. The Monday morning after Evelyn's arrest, I got a call from the HOA board requesting an emergency meeting. "Carter," said board member Thompson, "we're calling for an immediate vote to remove Evelyn from her position as president. The entire board wants you to attend as our guest." I agreed to be there, knowing that this meeting would officially end the battle that had started with a 30-minute timer and a fabricated regulation about cabin placement. The community center was packed that evening with over 200 residents, the largest HOA meeting attendance in Juniper Crest Reserve history. Local news crews were there to cover what everyone expected to be a historic vote. Evelyn appeared with a new lawyer, released on bail pending her criminal trial for assault and property destruction. She tried one last time to defend her actions, claiming that I had orchestrated a harassment campaign against her and that she'd been protecting community values from outside agitators. The evidence presented against Evelyn was overwhelming. The board reviewed the timeline of harassment, played recordings of her discriminatory comments, and heard testimony from multiple residents about her pattern of abuse and intimidation. An elderly neighbor, despite being shaken by the assault, stood up and told the room about how Evelyn had been bullying homeowners for months. Other neighbors shared similar stories of threats, fabricated violations, and attempts to drive out residents who didn't meet Evelyn's arbitrary standards. The vote to remove Evelyn from her position as HOA president was unanimous, 47 votes in favor, with only Evelyn voting against her own removal. The board also voted to implement new transparency requirements, including recorded meetings, public access to all documents, and a homeowner bill of rights that would prevent future abuse. All charges and fines against me were officially dropped, and the board issued a formal public apology for the harassment I'd endured. Evelyn's legal troubles were just beginning. She faced criminal charges for assault, harassment, property destruction, and filing false police reports. She also faced civil liability for my legal expenses and the costs associated with the illegal barriers she'd erected around my cabin. Rather than fight the charges and risk a public trial that would further humiliate her, she pleaded guilty to all charges and accepted a sentence that included community service, anger management classes, and restitution payments. Within a month of her arrest, Evelyn's house went up for sale. She'd become so notorious throughout Colorado that she couldn't go anywhere without being recognized as the woman who assaulted an elderly neighbor on live television. She eventually moved to a different state to start over, but her name had become permanently associated with HOA corruption and abuse of power. Law schools started using her case as an example of how not to manage community associations. I decided not to pursue civil litigation against Evelyn personally. Instead, I used the money I'd raised through the educational tours to establish the Homeowner Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping people fight HOA abuse. The fund provides legal resources, educational materials, and support networks for homeowners dealing with bullying and harassment from their associations. My cabin, which had started as a weekend retreat and became the center of a major controversy, was now a symbol of homeowner rights across Colorado. The transformation of our community was remarkable to witness. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak up for years were suddenly organizing block parties and community improvement projects. The fear that Evelyn had cultivated through intimidation was replaced by genuine cooperation and mutual respect. People started volunteering for HOA board positions, not to control others, but to actually serve their community. The change was so dramatic that real estate agents began marketing Juniper Crest Reserve as a model of democratic community governance. What surprised me most was how quickly other communities reached out for guidance. Within weeks of Evelyn's removal, I was receiving calls from HOA boards who wanted to prevent similar situations in their own neighborhoods. They were asking for advice on transparency measures, conflict resolution, and how to rebuild trust with their residents. It became clear that the problems we'd faced weren't unique to Juniper Crest's reserve, and that people everywhere were hungry for better ways to manage their communities. The broader impact of the whole situation exceeded anything I could have imagined. The Whitman method of educational tours was copied by homeowner advocates in dozens of communities. Several corrupt HOA boards resigned rather than face the kind of public scrutiny that had destroyed Evelyn's reputation. Colorado passed new legislation strengthening homeowner protections and requiring additional transparency from community associations. On a personal level, the experience taught me that sometimes you don't choose your battles, they choose you. I never wanted to become a homeowner rights activist, but when Evelyn threatened my cabin and my peace, I discovered I had a talent for organizing people and fighting bureaucratic bullies. Officer Brady eventually introduced me to his sister Sarah, who worked for a property rights nonprofit organization, and we found that we shared the same values about fairness and community. Within 3 months, my phone was ringing constantly. People from Texas, Oregon, and states across the country all had the same question: how do we take back our own voices? The work had spread far beyond anything I'd imagined. I started traveling to other communities on weekends, helping homeowners organize their own educational tours and advocacy campaigns. Each success story felt like a small victory against the kind of institutional bullying that too many people had accepted as normal. Property values in Juniper Crest Reserve actually increased after Evelyn was removed and transparent governance was implemented. The community became a model for other HOA neighborhoods, with regular town halls, open communication, and a genuine spirit of cooperation among residents. Local government officials visited to study our transformation, and several neighboring communities adopted similar transparency measures. As I sit here today on my cabin porch, drinking my morning coffee and watching the sunrise over the Colorado mountains, I often think about that Saturday morning when Evelyn set her 30-minute timer and thought she could intimidate me into abandoning my home. She wanted to silence me and drive me away, but instead she gave me the biggest platform I could have ever asked for. Sometimes the people who try to break you end up making you stronger than you ever imagined possible. I take a sip of my coffee and look out at the sun rising over the mountain range. Evelyn thought she'd crushed me with that countdown timer, but in reality, she'd just started a revolution. My phone rings again, another homeowner from another state asking for help. Carter Whitman speaking. Tell me about your HOA situation. The work continues, one community at a time, proving that ordinary people really can make a difference when they refuse to be bullied. Do you think more homeowners should organize educational tours to fight HOA abuse? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have your own HOA horror story, tell us about it. It might be our next video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more satisfying justice stories that prove good people can win when they don't give up.